We've all been there, caught in a relationship that feels like a puzzle you can't solve. One moment they're warm, attentive, even affectionate, and the next they vanish emotionally, leaving you confused, questioning your worth, and desperate for clarity. You try harder, you show more love, you prove you're safe, you're loyal, you're not going to abandon them, and still they pull away. When you're involved with someone who has avoidant tendencies, it's easy to feel like you're always one step behind emotionally. They pull away, go silent, become distant, and it creates a frantic loop in your head. Did I do something wrong? Did I come on too strong? Should I have texted less, talked less, needed less? You start adjusting your behavior, walking on eggshells, afraid that one wrong move will cause them to disappear completely, and so the emotional power shifts away from you. But here's the truth that most people never realize until it's too late. Avoidants don't respond to overfunctioning. They don't respect chasing. What shifts the dynamic, what causes them to pause, reevaluate, and often come back isn't more of your emotional investment, it's your emotional detachment. Now, detachment doesn't mean being cold or cruel. It means you no longer tie your sense of self-worth to their ability or inability to show up for you emotionally. It means your mood isn't dictated by their moods. It means you've stopped making their inconsistency a reflection of your value. Avoidants tend to pull away when things feel too intimate, too close, or too vulnerable. That closeness often triggers a deep fear within them, fear of being seen, fear of needing someone, fear of being depended on or let down. So when they feel that connection building, their instinct is to retreat. But here's where it gets interesting. The more you lean in, the more they lean out. It creates a dynamic where you end up doing all the emotional labor and they remain distant, walled off, and in control. But the game changes the moment you stop playing, the moment you stop trying to win them over, stop begging for clarity, stop proving your worth. The entire power dynamic shifts when you pull back, not as a manipulation, but as an act of self-respect. They feel it, and not just in a surface way. Deep down, they notice the silence. They feel the absence of your emotional energy, which they've been feeding off of, whether consciously or not. Because here's the part they don't expect. They're used to people chasing them. They're used to people trying harder. When they pull away, they rely on that pursuit to validate their worth while keeping themselves safely disconnected. So when you break that pattern, it shakes them, it makes them question their assumptions, it introduces a kind of tension they can't control, and that's when everything starts to shift. You stop asking, why don't they want me? And you start asking, why am I trying to convince someone to see my value? That's a powerful place to stand. It's not emotional indifference, it's emotional clarity. You've likely spent so much time over analyzing their behavior that you forgot to analyze your own. Why do you keep giving energy to someone who makes you feel insecure? Why are you afraid to walk away from a person who barely shows up? And the hardest question of all, why have you made their avoidance your responsibility to fix? Detachment brings you face to face with those questions, and it forces you to reclaim your emotional center. You begin to realize that loving someone doesn't mean tolerating emotional breadcrumbs, that wanting connection is not a justification for abandoning your own boundaries, that your job in a relationship isn't to constantly prove you're safe to someone who's unwilling to be open. And once you reach that place, you show up differently. You're calmer, you're more grounded, You're no longer addicted to their validation, which means you don't flinch when they start acting distant. You don't spiral when the texts slow down. You don't react, you observe. And that right there is when the avoidant starts to notice a shift. They might not say it immediately. In fact, at first they may try to provoke a reaction, test if you'll chase, see if you'll fold. But the longer you remain anchored in your own emotional space, the more uncomfortable it becomes for them. Why? Because their usual escape hatch, the one where you come running, asking, pleading, fixing, is suddenly closed, and they're left alone with something they rarely confront: their own fear of losing you. Avoidants may not be comfortable with intimacy, but they're still human. They still crave connection. They still want to feel loved. And when the person who used to offer that love so freely suddenly stops chasing, they begin to wonder what changed. Did you meet someone else? Did you realize you deserved better? Did you see through the game? And the truth is you did. You saw that the power dynamic was only tilted because you kept giving yours away. You realized that the right person doesn't make you feel like you have to earn love. You learned that emotional safety doesn't come from chasing. It comes from choosing yourself. That moment of emotional detachment isn't the end of the relationship. It's the beginning of clarity. It forces the avoidant to face the consequences of their own withdrawal. Some of them will rise to meet you, some won't. But either way, you win, because you're no longer abandoning yourself for the hope that someone else might finally see your worth. So if you're wondering why avoidants always seem to crack once you stop caring so much, it's because your detachment shatters their illusion of control. They crumble not because they've changed overnight, but because the version of you that fed their comfort no longer exists. And once you become someone who no longer negotiates your value for temporary attention, everything about the relationship dynamic changes, starting with the way you see yourself. Avoidants operate with a paradox. They deeply crave connection but simultaneously fear the vulnerability it requires. This creates a push-pull dynamic in relationships where they seem close one moment and cold the next. They often back away when things start to feel too intimate, not because they don't care, but because the closeness feels dangerous. They associate emotional intimacy with losing control, getting hurt, or being overwhelmed. So they keep people at arm's length, not to be cruel, but to stay safe. At first, their distance confuses you. You try to make sense of it, rationalize it, maybe even excuse it. You tell yourself, maybe they've been hurt before, or they just need time. And so you wait, you give space, you try to be the understanding partner, you overcompensate, thinking that your consistency and reassurance will eventually make them feel safe enough to stay. But here's where most people go wrong. They mistake patience for progress. What actually happens is that your constant presence, your constant availability, becomes a certainty for them. They know you'll always be there. They know you'll wait. They know that no matter how much they pull away, you'll come back. And so, ironically, the very thing you do to make them feel secure is what makes them disengage more. Avoidants are drawn to certainty, but only once it's removed. They respond to space, to stillness, to absence. When you're always there, they don't have to confront what it would mean to lose you. But when you step back, not as a game, but from a place of emotional clarity, it forces them to feel the impact of your absence. That's when things start to shift. That's when they begin to question everything. See, avoidants aren't heartless. They just have a coping mechanism that's rooted in avoidance, not indifference. But they've learned that closeness often comes with expectations they're afraid they can't meet, so they create distance. But when that distance is met with silence instead of pursuit, It becomes a mirror. Suddenly they have to face the reality that someone they once took for granted is no longer trying, no longer chasing, no longer asking what's wrong, and that creates a tension they aren't used to, because now they're uncertain. They start to wonder, why aren't they reaching out? Have they moved on? Did they stop caring? And that uncertainty becomes an itch they can't scratch. Avoidants, as much as they seem emotionally distant, often require control over how close or far others are. When you remove their ability to manage that distance, you disrupt the script they've always followed. You stop dancing to the rhythm they set. This doesn't mean you should play games or become cold. It simply means that once you understand how avoidants operate, you stop rewarding their fear-driven behaviors, you stop interpreting their withdrawal as an invitation to give more, and you stop trying to soothe their discomfort at the expense of your own. You recognize that their hot and cold behavior isn't about you being too much, it's about them not knowing how to be close, and in that recognition something powerful happens. You release the need to prove yourself. You realize that no amount of effort will ever make someone stay who is committed to running. You see that the best way to draw someone closer is not to cling tighter but to let go gently, gracefully, and with peace. When you take away the certainty of your presence, the avoidant is left with space to feel, and feeling is what they've been running from. But without your energy constantly filling the silence, they're forced to sit with it, and in that space they begin to notice what they miss. They remember your warmth, your support, your consistency, but most importantly they feel the loss of it. Many avoidants don't process their emotions in real time, they process in hindsight. While you were there giving everything, they were too busy protecting themselves to feel the depth of your presence. But when you step back, they gain perspective, they start to miss what they once felt overwhelmed by, and that missing becomes the thing that softens their walls. This isn't about manipulating someone into wanting you, it's about restoring balance in a dynamic that's been skewed by fear. You're not punishing them, you're honoring yourself. You're no longer fighting to be seen by someone who's been looking the other way. You're creating the conditions for them to come toward you, not because you begged, but because they finally felt the cost of your absence. And it's not a guarantee they'll come back. Some avoidants won't, some will retreat deeper, but the ones who are emotionally capable of growth will begin to reassess. They'll feel the shift, they'll notice the change, and some of them will reach out, not from panic, but from genuine realization. The irony of the avoidant attachment style is that they're often most drawn to people who make them feel safe, but they test that safety by pushing it away. They subconsciously expect people to chase, to overextend, to prove love over and over. But when you finally stop, it's like pulling the rug out from under that entire pattern. That's when avoidants start to crumble, not because you've tricked them, not because they've magically changed, but because your absence forced them to finally feel the weight of their own defenses, and for perhaps the first time they have to decide stay safe and alone, or take the risk to be truly connected. When you stop chasing, stop fixing, and stop offering certainty, you give them a chance to show up, not because you begged for it, but because you created the space where showing up was the only path forward. And whether they take it or not, you've already won, because you've reclaimed your peace, your power, and your place at the center of your own emotional life. And that kind of certainty, the one that comes from within, is something no avoidant can ever take away. When you're dealing with someone who has an avoidant attachment style, it's easy to feel caught in an emotional whirlwind. They draw you in just enough to keep your hope alive, then suddenly retreat when things get too real. This hot and cold behavior keeps you guessing, doubting, and constantly recalibrating how you show up, hoping that one day they'll be consistent. But the real breakthrough doesn't come when they finally commit. It comes when you finally understand what's really going on. Avoidant behavior feels personal when you're in the middle of it. Their withdrawal feels like rejection. Their silence feels like punishment. You start internalizing their detachment as a direct reflection of your inadequacy. I wasn't good enough. I was too needy. I scared them off. That's the story that starts to play in your head, and it's a dangerous one, because once you believe that narrative, you'll spend the entire relationship trying to fix it, trying to fix yourself, when the issue was never really about you in the first place. Avoidants often struggle with emotional closeness, not because they don't care, but because they don't know how to safely engage in intimacy without losing themselves. They've learned somewhere in their life that vulnerability is risky, that love comes with strings attached, or that dependence leads to disappointment. So when they start to care about you, it creates an internal tension. On one hand, they want connection. On the other, they fear what it might cost them. This is why they pull away just when things start to deepen. It's not because you've done something wrong. It's because being close to you triggers a part of them that associates intimacy with danger. But here's the part most people miss. When you understand that their withdrawal is rooted in fear, not truth, you stop making their behavior mean something about you. You stop seeing their silence as proof that you're unlovable, and you start recognizing it as a coping mechanism they've developed long before you entered the picture. Once you make that shift, you stop reacting with panic. You stop chasing, explaining, justifying, and overcompensating. You stop trying to soothe their fears by sacrificing your own needs. Instead, you step back and let them sit with their discomfort. You stop rewarding their distance with more closeness, and you start observing rather than absorbing. That observation gives you a kind of clarity most people never reach. You begin to recognize patterns. You start to predict when the withdrawal is coming, not because you're bracing for rejection, but because you finally see the emotional blueprint they operate from. And in that awareness, you become untouchable in the best possible way. The power that once belonged to them, the power to make you feel small, confused, or uncertain, dissolves, because now you're no longer caught off guard by their inconsistency. You understand it. You don't excuse it, but you stop internalizing it. And that is where their power starts to crumble. Avoidants rely on confusion to maintain distance. When you don't know what they're thinking, when you're constantly trying to figure them out, you're distracted from your own needs. You become emotionally dependent on their crumbs of affection. You get stuck in a cycle of proving your worth, hoping that one day they'll give you the security you crave. But once you understand that their avoidance is about them, not a measurement of your value, you stop playing the game. They may still pull away, they may still retreat into silence, but now you see it clearly. It's a defense, not a declaration. You stop making it your responsibility to fix. You don't chase. You don't overextend. You give space without collapsing. And that's when something shifts, not just in you but in them, because now they are the ones left with the questions. Why didn't they respond like they used to? Why aren't they chasing me? Did I lose them? That emotional certainty they once had, the comfort of knowing you'd always be there no matter how much they pulled back, is gone. And that's when the avoidance starts to feel what you felt all along, uncertainty. Understanding their pattern isn't about tolerating it, it's about disarming its power over you. It's about seeing the difference between a connection and a coping mechanism, because just because someone feels like home doesn't mean they're healthy for you. Just because someone triggers intense feelings doesn't mean those feelings are rooted in love. They might be rooted in unresolved emotional wounds. You don't heal those wounds by begging someone to stay. You heal them by recognizing when someone's behavior is a reflection of their own fear, not your failure. And the more you see that, the less their avoidance impacts you. It doesn't mean you stop caring. It means you care enough about yourself not to get pulled into someone else's emotional maze. You stop chasing closure from people who are running from their own vulnerability. You stop making inconsistent love your standard. Eventually, avoidants who are capable of growth will sense the difference. They'll feel your shift, and for the first time they may have to confront their own emotional patterns, not because you pointed them out, but because your calm, quiet withdrawal left space for reflection. Some of them will rise, some will run, but either way, your job is no longer to explain, chase, or fix. Your job is to see clearly and choose accordingly. Understanding their pattern doesn't just free you from their grip, it restores your connection with yourself. It reminds you that love should feel safe, mutual and nourishing, and that when someone pulls away, it's not always your cue to do more. Sometimes it's your cue to let them go and make room for someone who won't run when things get real. Once you understand this, the entire dynamic changes. You stop dancing around their fear and you start honoring your truth. And from that place, you don't just protect your heart, you elevate it. There comes a moment in every emotionally lopsided connection, especially with someone avoidant, when you reach a point of stillness. It doesn't happen overnight. It happens after countless internal debates, after trying every approach you thought might help. After second-guessing yourself into exhaustion, you wake up one day and realize you're tired, not bitter, not angry, just done. And in that quiet moment, something shifts. You stop fighting for the connection. You stop trying to be chosen. You stop making the relationship the center of your emotional universe. That moment is powerful, not because you've given up, but because you finally let go. You've stopped operating from a place of scarcity, of lack, of fear that if you don't hold on tighter, they'll disappear for good. You realize that their emotional absence has been a constant weight, and letting go is the only thing that allows you to breathe again. This is the turning point, when you finally detached, not from a place of resentment but from clarity. Everything changes. You no longer react to their silence. You no longer feel the urge to decode their every word, text, or behavior. You don't ask, "What are we?" Every time they pull away, you already know. You've stopped trying to squeeze love out of inconsistency, and that's when the balance of power shifts, not through control, but through peace. Avoidants function in a dynamic where they feel safest when you are unsure. When you're doubting yourself, you're not doubting them. When you're anxious about the relationship, you're not focused on what you need. They may not do it consciously, but they're used to holding the emotional remote control, pressing pause, mute, rewind, whenever closeness feels uncomfortable. But when you stop playing the role they're familiar with, the emotional ecosystem they rely on starts to collapse. You're no longer the one reaching out. You're no longer the emotional safety net. You've become emotionally neutral, and that neutrality is disorienting for someone who's used to controlling the distance. They might initially respond with confusion. They may test your resolve, suddenly reappear, or subtly try to pull you back in with crumbs of attention, not because they're ready to truly connect, but because they miss the emotional security you used to provide. They miss the certainty of your pursuit, the calm of knowing they didn't have to show up fully because you were doing enough for both of you. But now the rules are different. You're no longer driven by what they do or don't do. Your decisions are guided by how you feel. You're not punishing them. You're just no longer participating in a dynamic that constantly leaves you uncertain. You're finally choosing emotional self-respect over romantic fantasy, and that's where avoidants often begin to crack. Not in a dramatic way, but in small noticeable shifts. They may reach out more, ask vague questions, comment on how you've changed. It's subtle, but underneath it is discomfort, not necessarily because they've suddenly decided to become emotionally available, but because the script they've relied on no longer works. They feel the void your energy once filled, the attention, the validation, the emotional labor, it's gone, and that forces them into a corner. Either evolve or lose the connection. For some, that moment sparks growth. They begin to examine their patterns, ask hard questions, and slowly open up. For others, it sends them deeper into avoidance. But in either case, you are no longer emotionally entangled in their indecision, because you've seen behind the curtain now. You understand that love should not feel like a performance, a puzzle, or a prize you have to earn. You know that real intimacy doesn't require you to shrink, chase, or wait endlessly. You've come home to yourself. This isn't about winning or losing. It's about remembering your worth, remembering your power, remembering that your value doesn't decrease in someone else's confusion. You're no longer trying to convince someone to see what's been obvious all along. You're just quietly walking away from anything that makes you forget it. And the person who once had the upper hand, the one you tried so hard to understand, is now left wondering what happened, not because you made a dramatic exit, but because you stopped showing up the same way. You stopped offering free access to your heart without the commitment to match it. You stopped accepting emotional crumbs and calling it a meal. Avoidants crumble when the person they depended on emotionally finally detaches, because that detachment reveals a truth they've been avoiding. You can't keep someone halfway in. Sooner or later, the person who gave their all will walk away, not because they stopped caring, but because they started caring more about themselves. And that's where your freedom lives, in the quiet decision to stop trying, in the moment you shift from asking, will they come back, to asking, why was I holding on, in the calm that follows when you choose peace over potential. People think power in relationships comes from control, from being desired, from being the one who's chased, but the real power, it comes from clarity, from the knowing that you deserve love that doesn't make you feel like a stranger in your own story, from walking away without needing them to understand why, because you understand, and that's enough. The most significant shift happens not when they change, but when you do. When you stop asking them to be someone they can't be, when you stop editing yourself to fit into their comfort zone, when you stop tolerating confusion and call it compatibility, at that point, whether they return or not becomes irrelevant, because you're no longer waiting, you're living, you're loving, with open eyes, clear boundaries, and an unshakable sense of who you are. And once you've reached that place, avoidants no longer have power over you. They're simply people with patterns, and you finally stopped letting those patterns shape your peace.